Prepare for acceleration in the temporal space.
Accelerated.
3DO was created by Trip Hawkins, founder of Electronic Arts. It had a unique approach to manufacturing the console in that the design specs were licensed out to third parties for production of their own units, causing the initial price to be very high at retail, since it was common for Sega and Nintendo to sell their consoles at a loss and recoup the money through publishing titles on the system. The 3DO was released in 1993 for $699. It got a fair amount of hype leading up to its release because of the graphical capabilities, particularly with 3D polygonal gaming. The price tag was considered pretty ridiculous, but similar to the elusive Neo Geo AES, which was $650 at the time, released in 1991. Panasonic is often associated with the 3DO because they were one of the most prominent manufacturers of the console, aside from Gold Star and Sanyo. I remember some of the computer stores like Electronic Boutiques had a display unit that you could try. It seemed quite impressive at the time, but I never knew anyone that actually owned one. The system received quite a variety of releases, from first-person games to racing games, fighting games, and of course, the dreaded FMV game. The quality of the games was mixed. Some titles that had releases on the SegaCD looked much better, as I mentioned before, and closer to the PC versions, while others felt like more than a tech demo. The platform was rather publisher-friendly, with not much oversight and costs associated with releasing content in the 3DO, hence a large spectrum of both good and poor titles. Studios such as Naughty Dog and Crystal Dynamics supported the console by creating games for the 3DO in their early days. The 3DO was discontinued by 1996, with plans for a follow-up system, the M2, that never saw release. Some of the factors that led up to this were the price that was far too much for most people, and the lack of games at release, as well as the PlayStation and Sega Saturn having arrived with their own advantages, in addition to the many other consoles available, such as Atari Jaguar and CDI. As mentioned, the games share several titles in common with other consoles, such as Need for Speed, which became arguably better on the rival systems. However, that doesn't mean there isn't still some very interesting games worth checking out on 3DO. For the categories we're going to look at the 3DO, it's just fighting games, exclusives, first-person shooter games, and last, some FMV games. Samurai Showdown is the first one to talk about, and this is an example of how good a game could be on the 3DO. It plays very similar to the arcade. There is some load times, but they're not hugely painfully long load times. And it's just a genuinely great experience to play this on the 3DO. Very impressive. So of course, if we mention Samurai Showdown, we have to mention Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. And this improved mostly from the music perspective from the original Street Fighter 2 or Super Street Fighter 2. So you have that full roster of characters, and you have that ability to use the turbo as well as the super move. So I do believe this is one of the first versions of Street Fighter 2 that had the ability to use a super move. A good Street Fighter game that still holds up in my opinion. The next one is Eye of Typhoon. Now this is a rare Korean game that you don't hear about too often. It's actually very difficult to obtain an original copy, so this is another one where a backup copy or a reproduction might be a good idea if you want to check it out. And it's very similar to those SNK style fighters, Neo Geo kind of fighters. Not as high quality, of course, but overall it's pretty interesting, and I think it plays pretty well. And the last fighting game I wanted to mention is Way of the Warrior, and this is the game that Naughty Dog created, and it is pretty terrible. So It looks pretty good. It has huge character sprites that are digitized, Mortal Kombat style, but the gameplay is just horrible. The fighting mechanics are really odd. The moves are kind of similar to Street Fighter, but the way that the actual fight, it's just really bizarre, and I struggle playing this game. I've sat here for a long time playing it sometimes, only to barely beat one or two people, and so I can't really get anywhere, and yeah, it's just a pretty awful game altogether. This is one of those ones that really gave the digitized Mortal Kombat genre a bad name, which, you know, isn't the best example of a fighter game. So avoid this one, I would say. Now, moving on to the exclusives. Road Rash, which did, of course, get other versions. There's the Genesis version, and there is a PlayStation version, but the 3DO version is unique in some ways, and this was one of the main reasons to get a 3DO when it was released. So it plays really well. There's a lot of fun, hilarious cutscenes. It made a good use of the 90s aesthetic, a good use of the video. This is a good game for the system. Super Wing Commander is an interesting upgrade to the original, but it's not really that great if you like a PC version of Wing Commander. This one doesn't really do anything to improve it or change it. It just uses all new assets. So some of the sprite art is actually pretty impressive and pretty incredible on the faces of the characters, but the voice acting is just deadpan sometimes. If you're really into Wing Commander and you want to try all the versions, but otherwise, maybe it's not the best. Slayer. This is a unique RPG game that's from the Dungeons and Dragon universe, and it plays like a early 3D shooter, like Wolfenstein 3D. So it's got a lot of RPG elements added into it, which makes it a really cool looking and interesting game. Very unique that you don't hear about this one too much. And that leads us right into the first-person shooters. So the first one I wanted to mention is Killing Time. This is one of my preferred shooters for the system. It's pretty fun. It's got a creepy interaction with ghosts that are around the mansion. So as you go through the game, you encounter different spirits and they tell the story. Playing the game now, however, it doesn't really hold up so great. So it's a little bit choppy in how it actually runs, but I do like the art style a lot, and some of the weird creepy music and areas in the game have a cool atmosphere. So I'd say check it out if you like kind of older FPS games. Next one is Space Hulk, and this is one that I see mentioned a lot in terms of the 3DO, and it was one of those really impressive looking games that you would see a lot of people talk about. But when you try to play this, it's not really. It looks like a first-person shooter, and you do control it like a first-person shooter, but you have to play it like a strategy game. So you're actually given multiple units, and the way I play it right now is I just have to go to the training modes, because if I try to play the regular game, I just get destroyed far too quick. So it's all about how you plan out in your squad. It's pretty tough, but if you like strategy games or you like this series, you should check it out. Another weird one to mention is PO'd, which I always thought that was the weirdest name. Like, didn't really make sense to me at the time as a kid, wondering why do they call it PO'd. And it has a very weird sense of humor where the bad guys are just these odd objects like body parts, or just a weird variety that starts you off, and you have a frying pan, and for some reason there's a foot meter in the corner. I guess there's a part of the game where you have to walk on glass, like in Die Hard or something, but yeah, what a weird game. But it was mentioned a lot in magazines and stuff at the time to kind of show off here's what the 3DO can do. Look at these 3D graphics, you know. So people were generally kind of wowed by it. And I didn't remember people making much of a big deal of how weird it was just because it was the 90s. The last one to mention is Wolfenstein 3D, one of the pioneering games of the genre. And this is a great version of it here on the 3DO. It's one of the standout first-person games for the system. And it feels like they've actually updated graphics, and you know, it's the same game, but it plays a little bit different. It looks a little bit different from the PC version, and they did a good job with it here. To wrap it up for the 3DO is some FMV games, and the first one to mention is Starblade, a Namco title that was a pretty big arcade hit for its time, and it got a pretty good port here. So this version, same one, did also appear on the PlayStation a little bit later, but it was pretty good to see it on the 3DO. Definitely one of the more interesting rail shooters to get for the system. Another one is Burning Soldier, and similar rail shooter kind of gameplay. In my opinion, it doesn't quite hold up as well, where in Starblade you saw more of these 3D kind of objects on the foreground that you'd interact with. This one is mostly all just 2D sprites that scale at you, and it's just far too repetitive after you played it for a while, but still it's pretty interesting. Mega Race, now this was another semi-popular CD-ROM title that was on PC, and it's pretty faithful here on the 3DO. So lots of FMV cutscenes all over the place, and the game is basically you're racing on a track that's just an FMV background where the edges are defined. You can't go off the track, you actually run into barriers, and it's more a battle kind of thing where you have to destroy the other cars or they destroy you. So not a very deep game, but an interesting looking game for the time. And I just wanted to also mention Sewer Shark, which saw a release on the 3DO, as I mentioned before, and it does look quite a bit better. So just kind of as a comparison, this is how much better it looks, or how much better FMV games or video in general could be played on the 3DO compared to the SegaCD, which is a big difference.
Get this crate on track, That's